Don't look back, just run. The desert dust carried more than sand that morning. He carried omens. The wind was blowing hot among the wooden buildings of Cedar Ridge, a small town that survived on the hope and sweat of honest people. The streets still kept the silence of dawn when the first rays of sunlight began to draw long shadows on the beaten ground. Thomas Mitchell watched the horizon from his balcony. At the age of 52, he had learned to read the signs that the desert sent. His calloused hands held a still steaming cup of coffee as his eyes scanned every movement in the distance. There was something wrong with that dawn. The silence was different, heavier, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The Mitchell farm was at the entrance to the town, a position Thomas had always considered strategic. From there I could see who arrived and who left. He was a man of few smiles, but with a firm word. His wife, Sarah, had passed away 3 winters ago, swept away by a fever that even the doctor could not explain. From then on, Thomas lived only with his daughter, Emma, a 23-year-old girl who had inherited her father's determination and her mother's kindness. Emma appeared at the kitchen door, drying her hands on her apron. Her brown hair was tied up in a simple bun, and there was a concern in her blue eyes that Thomas knew well. She also felt that something was different that morning. The sound of distant hooves came to them like a deep murmur. Thomas stood up slowly, leaving the cup on the worn wooden table. They were not the hooves of well-known horses. They didn't have the calm cadence of the animals they knew on their way home. They were urgent, multiple. They came in a group. Emma approached her father, and they both watched the cloud of dust that was forming on the horizon. It was too early for honest visitors. Merchants didn't travel in such large groups, and the sheriff had been in the capital for 2 weeks, resolving legal issues that the small town couldn't handle on its own. Thomas walked to the corner of the porch where he kept his rifle. He was not a violent man, but the West had its own rules, and prudence was one of them. Emma followed him with her eyes, feeling her heart racing. She had been born and raised in those lands. She knew every stone, every tree, every bend in the path. He knew when something didn't belong there. The nights appeared among the hills, like shadows taking shape. There were 7 men mounted on animals, tired from the journey. Even from a distance, Thomas could tell that they were not coming on a peaceful mission. There was something about the knight's posture, the way they held the reins, that spoke of intentions that didn't match the quiet dawn of Cedar Ridge. Emma held her father's arm. His fingers trembled slightly, but his voice came out firm as he whispered that perhaps it would be better to warn the neighbors. Thomas shook his head. It was too late for that. The men had already spotted them and changed direction, riding directly to the farm. The leader of the group was a tall, dark-bearded man with a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows on his face. He raised his hand, signaling for the others to stop a few meters from the balcony. The silence that followed was as thick as the midday heat. Thomas kept the rifle low, but visible. It was a silent warning that he would not be caught off guard. The man with the dark beard got off his horse with calculated movements. There was elegance in his gestures, but also a coldness that made Emma take a step back. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an accent that didn't belong in those lands, something that came from places where the law was more of a suggestion than a rule. He said he was looking for information on the routes leading to neighboring towns. He asked about schedules, about how many men worked on the nearby farms, about when the sheriff would return. These were questions that seemed innocent, but Thomas could recognize when someone was gathering information he shouldn't have. Emma remained quiet by her father's side, but her eyes did not miss any movement of the visitors. She noticed how they watched every detail of the property, how their gazes lingered on the animals in the corral, on the well-kept house, on the signs of prosperity that Thomas had built with decades of honest work. The wind changed direction at that moment, bringing with it the smell of dry land and something else, something that Emma couldn't immediately identify, but that made her stomach twitch. It was the smell of danger. It was the smell of changes that no one had asked for, but that arrived anyway, mounted on tired horses and loaded with dark intentions. Thomas answered the questions politely, but without offering more information than necessary. He said that the sheriff would be back in a few days, that the farms in the area had many workers, that the routes were well known to any honest traveler. They were carefully constructed half-truths, protective lies that experienced men know how to weave when necessary. The leader of the knights smiled when he heard the answers. It was a smile that didn't reach the eyes, an expression Emma would never forget. He thanked them for the information, mounted his horse, and signaled to the others. They left as they had arrived, in a cloud of dust and silence, laden with unspoken promises. Thomas and Emma remained on the balcony long after the knights had disappeared over the horizon. The sun was already high when they finally entered the house, but neither of them could forget the feeling that something had changed forever that morning. The West was generous to those who respected it, but ruthless to those who defied its unwritten rules. Emma prepared breakfast in silence, but her hands trembled as she cut the bread. Thomas cleaned the rifle more carefully than usual, checking each mechanism as if his life depended on it. And maybe it really did. The day followed its normal course on the surface, but underneath the routine was a new tension. It was as if Cedar Ridge was holding his breath, waiting for something that had not yet been named, but that was already casting its shadows over the quiet town that had never asked for visits like that. 3 days had passed since the rider's visit, but Cedar Ridge was unable to get back to his normal pace. People spoke in whispers in the market, looked over their shoulders more often, and men checked their guns more often than usual. Thomas had quietly spread the news about the outsiders, and now the whole town was on alert. Emma couldn't concentrate on her daily tasks. Every time he heard the sound of hooves on the road, his heart raced. She had begun to carry a small knife in her waistband, hidden under her apron, something she had never done before. The father noticed the change, but said nothing. In the West, preparing for danger was a silent language that everyone understood. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, young Billy Santos galloped up to the Mitchell farm. His normally quiet 17 years were transformed by panic. He had ridden non-stop from the Henderson farm, bringing news that no one wanted to hear. The knights had returned. This time, they weren't asking questions. Billy told between gasping breaths that the 7 men had broken into the Hendersons' property in the early hours of the morning. They took everything they could carry, horses, cattle, provisions, and the money that old Henderson kept in a metal box. There were no serious injuries, but the family was terrified. The bandits had made it clear that Cedar Ridge was just the beginning. Thomas listened to the report with a tense jaw. Emma held the edge of the kitchen table until her knuckles turned white. Reality had come into their lives like a sandstorm that swallows everything in its path. Cedar Ridge was being attacked by an organized gang, and without the sheriff in town, defense would depend on the residents themselves. The farmer asked Billy to spread the word to the other properties while he and Emma prepared to go to town. It was time to gather the able men and plan a response. The West did not forgive passivity in the face of injustice, and Thomas was not a man to hide when his community needed him. Emma insisted on accompanying her father, even though she knew he would prefer to leave her safely at the farm. But security had become an illusion since the morning the knights appeared on the horizon. In addition, she knew every family in the city. She knew who had small children, who was sick, who would need special help in case they needed to evacuate. Downtown Cedar Ridge looked different when Thomas and Emma arrived. The windows of the houses were closed, even with the heat of the day, and few people circulated on the streets. The church hall had become a makeshift meeting place where the men of the city discussed strategies in low, serious voices. Marcus Webb, the most prosperous merchant in the region, was coordinating the discussion. At the age of 40, I had enough experience to understand that organized bandits did not stop at the first robbery. They would come back, and next time they would be bolder. The question was not whether they would attack again, but when and where. Thomas joined the group and shared his observations about the knights. He described the dark, bearded leader, The calculated way in which they had asked their questions, the professional manner in which they had observed the property. They were not ordinary criminals. They had experience and planning. This made them much more dangerous. Emma stood near the door of the church, watching the movement in the street. It was then that she saw her. A young woman, perhaps her own age, was walking slowly down the main street. There was something strange about her posture, as if she was lost or looking for something. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and her dress showed signs of a long and difficult journey. The stranger stopped in front of the hall and hesitated. Emma could see that she was debating to herself whether to go in or not. There was fear in her eyes, but also a determination that Emma recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was ready to face the consequences. Emma approached the door and caught the woman's attention. When their eyes met, the stranger took a deep breath and climbed the steps of the church. She introduced herself as Catherine Morgan, but her voice trembled as she said her last name. Emma invited her in, noticing that Catherine was carrying important information. Inside the church, Catherine asked to speak to the men who were planning the defense of the city. Her voice gained firmness as she told her story. He had traveled for 2 days to reach Cedar Ridge, fleeing from a town called Millfield, located to the west. The same 7 knights had attacked Millfield a week earlier. The silence in the church grew even thicker as Catherine described what had happened in her town. The bandits were not satisfied with just robbery. They had established a sort of control over Millfield, demanding regular payments from all families in exchange for protection. Those who refused to pay faced consequences that Catherine preferred not to detail. Thomas and the other men listened to the report with growing concern. The pattern was becoming clear. The bandits were not just opportunistic thieves. They had a bigger plan, and Cedar Ridge was the next target of an operation to control the entire region. It was an organized form of crime that transformed prosperous cities into territories dominated by fear. Catherine explained that she had managed to escape Millfield during the confusion of another robbery. His family had a small cloth store, and the bandits had taken a special interest in the money they saved. When his father tried to resist, they made it clear that next time would be different. It was then that Catherine decided to leave, hoping to find help, or at least warn other towns about the danger. Emma watched Catherine as she spoke. There was courage in the young stranger, but also a vulnerability that touched her heart. Catherine had lost everything to save other people she didn't even know. It was the kind of sacrifice that the West both admired and rarely adequately rewarded. Marcus Webb asked the practical questions. How many men the bandits really were, what kind of weapons they carried, whether they had a known hideout in the region. Catherine answered what she could, but admitted that her information was limited. At Millfield, people had quickly learned that asking too many questions about the invaders was dangerous. Thomas got up and walked to the church window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky red and orange. They were beautiful colors, but they also reminded me of blood and fire. He knew that Cedar Ridge had reached a decision point. They could try to negotiate with the bandits as Millfield had done, or they could fight for the freedom of their community. The discussion in the church continued late into the night. Plans were made and discarded, strategies were debated, resources were counted. By the end, one thing was clear. Cedar Ridge would not surrender without a fight. It was a decision that carried enormous risks, but it was also the only way to maintain the dignity that their families had built with so much work. Emma offered Catherine shelter at the Mitchell farm. The young woman gratefully accepted, and during the return trip, the two women talked about their lives before the bandits arrived. Catherine talked about her family, about the plans she had made for the future, about dreams that now seemed impossible. Emma listened with compassion, acknowledging her own situation in the stranger's words. That night, while Catherine slept in the guest room, Thomas and Emma remained awake in the kitchen, drinking coffee and planning for the next few days. They both knew that their lives had changed forever. Dawn would bring new challenges, and Cedar Ridge would need to find out what it was made of when tested by fire. Dawn came with the sound of horses approaching. Thomas woke up even before the first ray of sunshine, his body trained over the years to recognize sounds that didn't belong on the farm. This time, however, they were well-known knights. Marcus Webb arrived accompanied by 4 other men from the city, all armed and with determined expressions. Catherine had woken up to the noise and appeared in the kitchen, still wearing the same dress as the day before. Emma offered him clean clothes and a hot coffee, simple gestures that spoke of the hospitality that still existed even in difficult times. There was something comforting about Catherine's presence, as if her courage had brought hope to that home that had long known only the company of father and daughter. Marcus brought urgent news. Overnight, the bandits had attacked 2 farms north of Cedar Ridge. This time, they were not satisfied with just robbery. They had burned a barn and left a clear message. The city had 3 days to prepare to welcome them as new rulers, or face the same consequences as other communities in the area. Thomas heard the account while checking his shotgun. Every movement of his hands was precise, the result of decades of experience with weapons that served both to hunt and to protect. Catherine watched these preparations with a mixture of admiration and sadness. At Millfield, few men had prepared to resist, and the price of passivity had been too high. Emma suggested that the women and children be taken to safety while the men organized the defense. But Catherine shook her head firmly. She had run away once, and didn't intend to do it again. He knew how to use basic weapons, and knew the bandits' methods better than anyone in Cedar Ridge. Your help could make the difference between victory and defeat. The discussion was interrupted by the sound of a distant gunshot. Everyone turned in the direction of the sound, hearts racing. Marcus climbed onto the roof of the house to get a better view of the area. What he saw made his blood run cold. A column of smoke rose in the distance toward the Peterson farm. The bandits had started their attacks earlier than expected. Thomas made a quick decision. He would divide his group. Some men would help the Petersons, while others would remain protecting the families who had taken refuge in the city. It was a calculated but necessary risk. In the West, abandoning neighbors in distress was unthinkable, even when it meant weakening their own defenses. Catherine asked to accompany the group that would go to the Petersons. Her determination impressed Thomas, who had misjudged her strength when she arrived in town, looking frail and lost. There was steel in that woman, tempered by the fire of the hardships she had faced. It was the kind of courage he had learned to respect over the years. Emma insisted on staying in the city, organizing the protection of the most vulnerable. She knew every family, every house, every possible hiding place in Cedar Ridge. Her presence would give confidence to the other women and help maintain order during the most tense moments. Thomas hesitated to leave her, but he knew that Emma had inherited her determination and wisdom. The group galloped off toward the Petersons' farm. Catherine rode with surprising skill, keeping up with the men even at a fast pace. Thomas observed his posture in the saddle and recognized someone who had grown up on a farm, someone who understood the language of horses and the land. There was more mystery in Catherine Morgan than she had revealed. When they arrived at the Peterson property, they found a desolate scene. The barn was on fire, and the family hid in the main house while 2 of the bandits stood guard outside. It was clearly a trap, designed to lure the men of Cedar Ridge and divide them. Thomas understood the strategy, but he could not abandon a family in distress. Catherine whispered a plan. She knew the tactics of Millfield's outlaws and knew that they always left an escape route. If they could identify this route, they could outflank the guards and create a distraction that would allow the Peterson family to be rescued. It was risky, but offered better chances than a frontal attack. Thomas studied the position of the bandits and the terrain around the farm. Catherine was right about the escape route. There was a trail leading into the hills behind the property, perfect for a quick retreat. If they managed to block this exit, the bandits would be cornered. It was a tactic that required perfect coordination and a bit of luck. The plan was executed with military precision. Two men positioned themselves on the escape trail, while Thomas and Catherine approached the house from opposite sides. Marcus and the fifth man remained in their original position, ready to create a distraction at the right moment. It was a complex operation that depended on the courage of each participant. Catherine moved through the low-lying vegetation with impressive agility. Thomas watched her and realized that she wasn't just a frightened refugee. There was training in their movements, tactical knowledge that came from actual experience. Who really was Catherine Morgan, and what had she not told her about her escape from Millfield? The first shot came from Marcus, signaling the start of the attack. The bandits reacted instantly, but found that their escape routes were blocked. The ensuing confusion lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough for Thomas and Catherine to make their way to the main house and escort the Peterson family to safety. During the retreat, one of the bandits tried one last desperate maneuver. Catherine saw him first and shouted a warning that saved Thomas's life. The farmer turned around in time to avoid a shot that could have been fatal. It was a moment of connection between them, a mutual recognition of courage and loyalty that transcended the circumstances of danger. The party returned to Cedar Ridge with the Peterson family safely, but everyone knew that this was only the first skirmish. The main bandits had not yet appeared, and the real battle for the city's freedom was yet to come. The next few hours would be decisive for the future of the entire community. During the return journey, Thomas rode alongside Catherine. There were questions in her eyes, curiosity about the skills she had demonstrated. Catherine noticed his gaze and smiled for the first time since she had arrived in town. It was a smile that carried secrets, but also a promise that his true abilities would still be revealed when needed most. Emma received them with evident relief. The city had remained calm during his absence, but the tension was palpable. People knew that time was running out. In less than 48 hours, the bandits would return in full force. Cedar Ridge would need to be ready for the fight of their lives. That night, as the men made the final preparations for the defense, Thomas found Catherine sitting on the porch, looking at the stars. There was a melancholy in his posture that he recognized. It was the same sadness he had felt when he realized that his peaceful life was coming to an end. They talked quietly about courage, about the choices that circumstances force people to make. Catherine has finally revealed more about her true story. His father was not just a cloth merchant. She had been a soldier, and she had grown up learning military tactics and weapons handling. When the bandits attacked Millfield, she tried to organize a resistance, but it arrived too late. His escape had not been just out of fear, but out of strategic necessity. She needed to find a community willing to fight. Thomas listened to her story with growing admiration. Catherine was no ordinary refugee. She was a warrior who had chosen Cedar Ridge as the place to make her last stand against injustice. He had found in the small town something worth protecting, something that justified the risk of everything. The third day arrived with the sound of thunder on the clear horizon. They were not storm clouds, but horsemen. Many knights. Thomas counted at least 15 men approaching Cedar Ridge, more than twice as many as the original group. The bandits had called for reinforcements for the final confrontation. Catherine was next to Thomas on the roof of the church, from where they had the best view of the city. She pointed to the leader of the group, the same man with a dark beard who had visited the farm days earlier. By her side rode someone she recognized immediately, Jake Morrison, the man who had destroyed Millfield and terrorized his family. Emma coordinated the defensive positions on Main Street. The women and children were safe in the basement of the church, but she had insisted on remaining with the defenders. Thomas felt pride in his daughter's courage, but also a fear he tried to hide. What was to come would test them all beyond their limits. The bandits stopped at the entrance to the city, just as Catherine had predicted. Morrison shouted out his conditions. Cedar Ridge had 1 hour to turn over all the community's money, livestock, and provisions. In return, they would allow people to continue living under their protection. It was the same proposal that had destroyed other cities in the region. Thomas climbed down from the roof and walked to the middle of the main street. His answer echoed clearly through the silent city. Cedar Ridge would not surrender. They were free people in a free land, and they would remain so as long as they had the strength to fight. The simple words carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. The first shot came from the bandits. The confrontation that followed was intense but brief. Catherine fought alongside Thomas with military precision, every calculated shot, every strategic move. Emma held her ground with determination, guarding the path to the church where families were hiding. The turning point came when Catherine recognized a weakness in the formation of the bandits. She shouted instructions to Thomas and Marcus, coordinating a movement that cornered Morrison and his leading men. It was the same tactic he had learned from his father, finally being used to protect innocent people. Morrison attempted a desperate retreat, but found that the residents of Cedar Ridge knew every trail, every hiding place on their land. There was no possible escape. The bandit leader surrendered when he realized that he was surrounded by people who were fighting for something greater than money or power. They were fighting for freedom. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was the silence of victory, of justice being done, of a community discovering its true strength. Cedar Ridge had won not only by individual courage, but by the unity of people willing to protect each other. Thomas and Catherine met in the center of the street when the dust finally settled. There was something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, a light that came from within, from someone who had found his place in the world. She was no longer a refugee. It was part of Cedar Ridge. Emma hugged her father with tears of relief. The city was safe, but more than that, it had discovered something about itself. In the darkest hours, Cedar Ridge had chosen courage over fear, unity over division. It was a lesson that would be passed on to the next generations. Catherine remained in town. In the weeks that followed, it helped to rebuild what had been damaged and to strengthen defenses for the future. His presence brought a sense of security that went beyond his military skills. It had brought hope. Thomas began to see her not only as an ally in the fight, but as someone who completed something he didn't know was incomplete. Their conversations became longer, more intimate. There was an understanding between them that grew with each shared day. On a starry night, sitting on the porch of the farm, Thomas finally found the courage to talk about feelings he had held onto for so long. Catherine listened with a smile that lit up her face, and her answer was simple but profound. She, too, had found something on Cedar Ridge that was worth more than any treasure. The wedding took place in the fall, when the leaves changed color and the air became cooler. Emma served as godmother, overjoyed to see her father find happiness again. The entire city participated in the celebration, united by shared experience and hope for a better future. Cedar Ridge continued to be prosperous and secure. The story of the resistance against the bandits became legend in the region, but for Thomas and Catherine, the most important thing was the life they had built together. They had learned that love, like courage, flourishes best when tested by adversity. The West had taught them that some battles are worth fighting, and that some people are worth any risk. Thomas Mitchell had found not only a companion, but a partner to weather any storm the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story of courage and love in the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting narratives. Each entry helps us bring more stories like this directly to you. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss any adventure. Until the next story, thank you for following our journey through the pioneer time.